Today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome someone I've known for a long time, Ross Sparkman, to the Digital HR Leaders podcast. Ross, it's great to have you on the show. Before we dive in, let's start with a quick introduction. And can you tell our listeners a little bit about your career journey and what led you to your role at Nutrien?
Yeah. First, great seeing you again, David. It's been too long, so I really appreciate the invite and the opportunity to take part in this podcast. I've been following it for a while. It's great. Yeah, by way of introduction, Ross Sparkman. I've been in this strategic workforce planning, people analytics space for 20 plus years, and kind of an interesting journey. I started my professional career off actually in the U.S. Navy, and I was spent about 10 years in the Navy, and I was at this sort of inflection point in my career in the military where I was, kind of ready to get out and join the private sector and was working on my MBA. And during that time in the MBA program, I was kind of taking some of my HR kind of org effectiveness classes and doing a lot of studying and reading on some of the stuff that Peter Capelli had written and David Ulrich and Jack Pitzens, which for some reason I think kind of resonated with me. And I think it was really because the work that I was doing in the Navy at the time was what we called manpower planning, which was kind of really operational workforce planning, and looking for a way to kind of bridge the gap between my military experience and the private sector. And I was just fascinated at this concept of, using planning and talent as a lever to drive organizational effectiveness and key business results. And so I started kind of connecting all these dots and decided that I really wanted to make that transition. So I was able to, once I finished the MBA, my time in the Navy, get into a role in consulting at Deloitte. And it was just the perfect playground at Deloitte to learn more of the private sector side of how businesses think about workforce planning and people analytics. It was really in the nascent ages of kind of when workforce planning, strategic workforce planning, and people analytics was starting to take off. So it was a pretty big service offering from Deloitte at the time. So it was just a great opportunity. I learned a lot of the modern frameworks and some of the work that Deloitte had done, and was able to take that experience and actually get hired by one of the organizations that we were working with at the time on a big people analytics and operating model engagement. So I went there and spent some time leading the people analytics function there, learned a lot. And then was really able to kind of leverage that experience and work with James Gallman and all the great folks at GE who were just at the time, I think, kind of on the forefront. Nick Garbus, so on the forefront of just strategic workforce planning, and really got to look and understand, under the hood, what it takes to really embed strategic workforce planning as a capability and a kind of end-to-end operating model. And so spent some time there at GE Aviation doing that, learning more and more and more. Then I had the opportunity to go to Facebook, now called Meta, which was going through sort of hyper growth at the time. And obviously, amazing opportunity to be part of the excitement that was happening in Silicon Valley at the time, and some of the revolutionary things that were happening in HR via Laszlo Bock and Google. And from there, kept learning, reading, studying, having conversations with folks like yourself, David. Started to kind of get into content creation and wrote my first book, Strategic Workforce Planning, Developing Optimized Talent Strategies for Future Growth. Took more of that experience and ended up going to LinkedIn, leading their workforce planning, then Nike. Then spent time at most recently at Walmart, really driving a lot of their workforce strategy around Gen AI integration with the workforce. And then I'm at this sort of point in my career where I wanted to get back to where I'm from, which is Calgary, up in Canada, for those that don't know. So I had an opportunity to take a role that I'm now in Calgary at Nutrien. And what this role is really focused on and centered on is again this intersection of evolving strategic workforce planning in the face of the massive technology disruption that's happening across the world right now with Gen AI and AI, and thinking through how do we do modern workforce planning, how do we integrate our AI strategy with our workforce strategy, acknowledging all the disruption and change that's coming down. In other words, we got to start making key decisions with our workforce today as this technology keeps evolving. So it's really exciting work. It dovetails off the work that I was doing at Walmart, and it's really the direction I think strategic workforce planning is headed.
Great. We're going to talk about lots of those topics that you've discussed, Ross, over the next hour. And obviously, we're going to talk about, you mentioned your book, Strategic Workforce Planning. The second edition has recently been published. We're going to be digging into that as well. But firstly, as someone that's been involved in the world of strategic workforce planning for, as you said, 20 years, and worked in some really impressive organizations, names that people will know very well, and different types of organizations as well. As you said, Meta, when it was Facebook, when it was really scaling, Walmart, one of the biggest organizations in the world, GE, as you said, one of the pioneers around strategic workforce planning. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the field of strategic workforce planning has evolved, and how you envisioning it developing in the future.
Yeah, it really has evolved, David. It's been quite the journey, and it's been just a pleasure to watch the evolution of that journey and be part of it. I think there's a few things that really jump out at me that have changed, in my time in this space. I think, if I think back to even my time in the military and in my early days when I was working at Deloitte and how we were thinking about this, it really was much more episodic and just more periodic in terms of we would oftentimes HR, not even HR, sometimes develop kind of a static plan. It was very high level, based on the budget. Here's how many talent and resources we need. Often didn't even include contractors, and kind of just put on the shelf. So it's very reactive. I think what we're seeing now, and the shift that I've seen over the years, is it's really moved from being this kind of reactive plan into more of a proactive plan. And that's where I think we start to see this intersection of strategic workforce planning versus workforce planning, where we're thinking about what is going to happen in the landscape, whether it's industry trends, whether it's macroeconomic environment, whether it's our own business model, that we need to think about in terms of our talent and our resources, and the way that we optimize our workforce. So it really went from reactive to more proactive. I think the other big piece, and this is where I was really getting interested in, kind of just mentioned in my early days, is that it's much more cross-functional and integrated with the business strategy than it used to be. So I think, again, in the past, it was more of a siloed exercise, maybe something that just sat within HR, and didn't necessarily take into account the full scope of the business model. As we're thinking about strategic workforce planning now, I think it's something that's more top of mind for leaders. And I don't know if it's been because of the last 5 years, everything that's happened with pandemic and some of the technological advances with AI, but it's much more top of mind in terms of leaders wanting to integrate workforce planning with their broader strategy, right? I developed this product. I want to know now what the implication is in terms of my workforce. Are we ready to launch this product? Do we have the capabilities and the skills? And this is always kind of sat in elements and parts of HR, but as I've seen strategic workforce planning evolve, it's much more formalized in terms of let's have a plan of action. Let's understand all the things that we need to consider as we launch this product, and the world continues to change, and industries evolve. I think the other piece, and I think a lot of your listeners will appreciate this, is it's much more data driven and analytical than it was in the past. I think before, workforce planning was largely a bottoms up activity where leaders would kind of give their requests for headcount, irrespective of any sort of wider, scope of what that impact could mean to the business. Now, when we think about strategic workforce planning, we really do want to use the data and the analytics to understand, what the drivers are of building that optimized workforce, but also a lot of the predictive things that we need to understand, right? How many people are going to leave? What skills are going to be emerging in the future? What's the impact, of manager effectiveness on attrition? All these different variables that we need to consider when we go to develop our plan. So it's much more data driven. It's less arbitrary, in terms of the way decisions are made, and thereby it becomes much more defensible. And I think it focuses, more on what leaders want to hear. I don't want some arbitrary plan that's not steeped in data, or doesn't make any sense. Tell me why you think the workforce should be this size, why we should be focusing on these skills, and show me the data to back up that, those thoughts. I think another thing that's really, really important now on sort of that same front is that, we've sort of went and shifted from being more roles-based planning to the acknowledgement that we have to be much more fluid in terms of how we do workforce planning at the skills level, right? Before it was, again, how many headcount do I need? Whether that's FTEs or contractors, irrespective of, what impact the skills of those uh, employees might have on our ability to execute the strategy. The focus now has shifted to say it's not so much about the headcount, it's more about the skills, the talent, right, that's needed to execute on this strategy. If I can have all the headcount in the world, but if nobody has the capability or the skills that we need to execute or develop product X, we're going to find ourselves at a disadvantage. And understanding the skills then translates into all these other aspects of learning and development, talent management, etc. So this concept of skills being part of the way we do workforce planning is much more important now, I think, in the broader context of workforce planning that has been in the past. A continuous and more agile planning is another big theme. I kind of mentioned this before. Before it was, maybe a once a year activity. That was it. Now it's an activity, or it should be an activity if we're doing it well, where we're checking in on it constantly. The world is just changing too fast. I mean, and you really have to be able to adjust and maintain an agile focus when you're doing workforce planning. And again, that just wasn't the case in the past. Um, so I think these are all some of the things. I think as we think about the evolution of the function, and I wrote a full chapter on this in my book. I think we're going to continue to see the proliferation of some of these concepts I just discussed. Much more of a skills-based focus. I think the importance of data is going to become more apparent than ever, and the reliance on the way that we use and leverage technology, whether it's AI or systems in the planning process, and then also in the way that we think about our resourcing requirements, is going to become more and more important. So those are just, I think, some of the things that are going to continue to kind of shape the future direction of strategic workforce planning.
And I guess, what I take from that is strategic workforce planning is becoming even more important because we live in such a disruptive world with technology changing things so fast. I mean, you look at that, obviously, you'll be looking at a variety of different external data sources, but if we take the World Economic Forum Future of Jobs report, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I think they talked over the next 5 years. There's going to be a net increase of 78 million jobs because certain jobs will disappear, certain new jobs will appear. And then the people's skills are going to have to be changing much more quickly and more fluidly than they did. And as you said, so your workforce planning or strategic workforce planning is so important, as you said, because number one, you need to make sure, have we got the capabilities? Can we build them? Do we need to buy them? What capabilities are going to be automated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as you said, that's very fluid, and you need to give the business some sort of visibility of a plan that can help them achieve their objectives, I guess.
Yeah, you mean you're spot on, David. I'll give you a really salient example just to put it into context of why it feels to me like, and this is just an anecdote, that it's becoming more important. I'd say my first 15 years, in the space, and I kind of mentioned it was much more siloed. I don't remember interacting with C-suite or being invited to board meetings or having direct calls with CEOs. I mean, in the last 2 months, in the last month since I've been in this current role, I've already been invited to the board, to have a discussion on strategic workforce planning. I've been in probably 6 meetings with C-suite individuals on the topic. This is 6 weeks into the role. I've been invited to, steer co's, and there just seems to be a much more of an ear from those senior leaders. To have these conversations, and I think it's to your point, David. It's a confluence of all these factors, and just like the things that have happened. Like, let's be real. Like, a lot of organizations just got it wrong over the pandemic, and they grew and grew and grew and grew, which I can speak at ad nauseum about. That was just bad workforce planning. And I think now that, a lot of leaders feel like they got burned, and want to be more thoughtful about how they do planning. So that's just one example, and you factor in all these other things that you just mentioned, and it really does feel like it's been elevated, and we'll see. But that's definitely the sense that I'm getting.
So, I mean, that makes your job leading workforce planning and other areas, more exciting, if
Exactly.
maybe a little more exposed. But we all want to have senior level interaction, working in these jobs, don't we? And ultimately, with workforce planning, if you've got the CEO and the board involved in that, then A, you see the strategic importance of that, but B, hopefully that means then that you get action on the plans that you're putting together.
That, I mean, and that point is, I can't emphasize that enough. Like if you start talking about like what helps with making succeed, strategic workforce planning successful, it's that executive buy-in. Like we're recommending strategies, we're recommending operating models, we're recommending cultural shifts and ways of working. It's difficult to do that if you don't have, and there's going to be resistance. There's a lot of tension in the workforce planning space, right? Like you got finance that's managing to a budget. You got leaders who want resources, grow my team, grow my team. You got HR that's working for the business leaders that feel the pressure from the leaders to get them more resources. And you're basically trying to say and tell everybody, listen, we got to meet this fine line balance of, having the right skills in the right place at the right time for the right cost. That's that's a lot of tension across a lot of different leaders. If you don't have somebody at the top saying like, what is best for the enterprise, right? It's whether it's right, reaching the right amount of skills and resources within the right budget. It becomes very difficult, and you have everybody and saying, "Oh, it's not working. It's not working." It's not necessarily that it's not working; it's that it's not working for your use case because you're not thinking end to end about what's best for the enterprise. When you have a CEO that's connecting those dots and C-suite that are connecting those dots, though, and understand like how you can impact shareholder value or the balance sheet, it's a different narrative, and I think they're starting to draw those conclusions.
So Ross, let's bring it. You mentioned the book, the second edition of Strategic Workforce Planning, which I definitely highly recommend to those of you working in workforce planning or interested in this topic who are listening. For listeners that know the first edition, or maybe those that are new to your work and maybe haven't seen the first version of the book, which I think it was published in 2018. So it's quite an update you've done, isn't it? What's changed, and why was now the right time to revisit and evolve it?
Yeah, yeah. So I think this has been, I mean, an amazing journey. Like you said, that was what, 7 years ago now, and there's been a lot that has changed in the world, but I've also had the benefit of the feedback from the first book, right? Having the opportunity to go out and speak with leaders like yourselves and setting up time and doing deep dives, with people that are practitioner boots on the ground that are trying to use the book to build a strategic workforce planning function or whatever their use case might be. So the first thing I'd say is that there's the book strikes a good balance, I'd say, between theoretical, kind of academic applications that we want to steep, the methodologies in, but also a lot more like tactical, real world, like playbook. If I want to build a strategic workforce planning function, here's what we want to consider from an operating model, from an org design capability. There was a lot of feedback around, okay, well, I need to be able to crawl before I walk. How do I even do just basic workforce planning correct? So I really wanted to make sure that the book provided both the theoretical, like here's why we need to do strategic workforce planning, because talent is a lever that can drive business outcomes. We need to align our strategy with our business outcomes, right? But how do you do that, right? And I think that was the piece that a lot of folks in this space don't understand. So I really wanted to spell it out really clearly with a lot of examples, frameworks, step by step. Do this, do this, do this, do this. Try this model, try this model. So a lot of that you'll find throughout the chapters, very specific metrics to look at. I think the other piece that I wanted to do was try to provide a little bit more real world examples. So every chapter has kind of like a day in the life of, and so whatever the topic might be, I try to bring it forward and say, here's how it would look in practice. Everything we just kind of discussed, all these frameworks, here's how what success would look like. So that's something I hope will be useful. In terms of new topics, there are some ones that are, I think, super relevant and timely. The first is really this concept of strategic workforce planning in the age of Gen AI and AI, which is just, again, as we kind of talked about, a huge just change in the way we do workforce planning, and there's a lot of implications on how we do it. So I wanted to really make it clear to everybody to understand, like, how can we use it to adopt and implement Gen AI, and what are some of the considerations that as we start to gain productivity from AI that we need to think about in terms of workforce. That there's a lot more depth and breadth around how we do kind of some of this skills-based workforce planning. Again, I just mentioned it, but it's going to be sort of the cornerstone, in my opinion, of what we need to be thinking about as again we continue to work side by side with Gen AI agents. So a lot more depth around skills based workforce planning. There's a much deeper connection between the end-to-end talent management process. So thinking about how we do strategic workforce planning from early career through to succession, and helping practitioners think about what's the role in strategic workforce planning. How do we kind of connect this all together? How do we build those outputs from a good talent management strategy into a good strategic workforce plan that's actionable? A lot of work and discussion around how do you actually lead a strategic workforce planning? How do you function? How do you build one? What are some of the basically this is just a chapter on things that where I failed, and things where I've succeeded, and kind of rolled it up and said here's some things that have not worked well for me. Don't make the same mistakes that I have, and here's some things that have. So a lot kind of on that, and then there's I know it's started to not be quite as popular, but I really did want to include some considerations for how we do kind of hybrid and remote work, and what that means in terms of our workforce strategy. And then just general, really getting tactical and ensuring that everybody can sort of connect the dots. So I probably, David, spent more time on the second edition than I did on the first edition, and it was just because I've learned so much more. I've gotten so much more feedback. There's so much that has changed in the last 7 to 8 years, that it was really exciting to write, and it's frankly it's given me an idea for 2 or 3 other books that I'm kind of in the process of outlining right now.
Really good. And we're going to dig into some of those topics
Great.
now, Ross. Again, you've talked a little bit about this in terms of having that senior level sponsorship for the work. But other than that, what are some of the other lessons that you've learned throughout your career, and maybe that you research for the book as well, about what actually makes workforce planning stick in an organization?
Yeah. Step number one is, like you just mentioned, you got to have that executive buy-in. There really needs to be a full alignment on and understanding on the value that strategic workforce planning can have, and it needs to start from the top. And I think that we're in a spot we're getting a lot more of that, but that's number one. I think one thing that I've learned, that's really important is you can't come in. You really do need, like if I'm a leader coming into a new organization, you really do need to get a sense for the company culture, how things operate, the industry, and the business, and ensure that when you're thinking about your workforce planning, that you're not taking a cookie cutter one size fits all approach. So, the approach of strategic workforce planning at Facebook or Meta was incredibly different in a high growth environment, where if you were to try to tell a leader like you need to develop a 5-year strategic workforce planning, you're just getting balked at, right? Like we're growing at 30% year over year right now. Mark Zuckerberg's theory is like, let's hire as many people as we can to build as much product to make as much money, to hire more people to build more products to make more. Like that's that, and he's offering $100 million compensation packages right now. So you can't be totally naive to what's going on in the culture versus like a GE, where we're a manufacturing company in some of our business segments. We need to think 5 years out. We're in a GE Aviation. There's a massive product life cycle when we're building engines. So that's one thing, is you make sure that you adapt to the company culture, and think about how do we need to develop a strategy that resonates with leaders. The cross-functional collaboration piece I can't stress enough. Like if I think about where there needs to be a lockstep partnership, like it's interesting. Usually it sits in HR, but in my mind, you can make the argument that it could sit in finance, that it could be its own standalone function, it could sit in HR, but there needs to be a really, really strong cross-functional collaboration and understanding. And this, I'm kind of referring to that tension that you feel between finance, between HR, between your business leaders. You need to have a really strong input into talent acquisition, which I know is part of HR. Your technology, HRS, and systems needs to be a big stakeholder. So this needs to be a business planning process, right? It needs to be, and on that note, that's another piece that's really important, is it needs to be built into the fabric how the company operates. Right. If you are doing your budget planning process, your short-term planning, workforce planning should be one of the key inputs or outputs of that process. It shouldn't be just a finance driven activity. And again, I see workforce planning as being the conduit between HR and finance and the leaders in that space. So there needs to be that ability to integrate it into the business processes and cadence of the business. It's important to build credibility when you're in this space. Again, there's a lot of folks that still just don't understand how it works. So to the extent that you're able to just get some quick wins, right? What's a tangible outcome that I can kind of get in the door and show how I can deliver value. So, maybe it's identifying a certain job profile that you were having a difficult time recruiting and developing a strategy around. How can you mitigate against the risk of that? What might that talent requirements look like? How can we leverage skills to mitigate against that gap? What's the buy, build, borrow strategy there? Anything that you can do to start small sometimes and demonstrate the value that you can bring to the table is going to be immensely important. I think it's really important also to have clear roles and responsibilities, and this is again kind of a shout out to that tension that I feel that I kind of mentioned. You need to have decision rights mapped out. Who has the final say on headcount, right? You need to have governance in place. You need to have review sessions that are formally, having all of your C-suite leaders get in and talk about their short and long-term strategic workforce plans. There needs to be an element of accountability. This is something, again, I think that is largely misunderstood in terms of importance of strategic workforce planning. And what I mean by that, David, is historically what I've seen. This is again anecdotal through my experience, is that for a lot of organizations there is a perception amongst leaders that if I have more scope in my job, I will get promoted, and often more scope means a bigger team that does more. And I'll be honest, I've seen that a lot, right? And so if there's a world where leaders are effectively being incentivized to build bigger teams, they're going to want more and more resources, and they're not necessarily going to be thinking strategically about how they're doing their workforce planning. So a good strategic workforce planning function that's ingrained in the broader interest of what's best for the company should incentivize good outcomes from workforce planning. How do you do more with less? Or how am I building the right skills and capabilities in the function? How am I leveraging skills across or employees across different roles rather than going in and trying to hire somebody externally? I think this is going to become more and more important, especially, like I said, with the ramp up coming out of the pandemic. But those are some of the things that are important. I'd say investing in capability building within the function, closer alignment with people analytics, ensuring that you can scale a workforce planning function, and that does require that capability across HR and leaders. These are all things that are very important and can be huge roadblocks in an organization's ability to do good strategic workforce planning.
And maybe one other thing on that, and I'm listening to you, bouncing off what you're saying there, Ross.
Yeah.
When I've spoken to your peers in other organisations, and obviously you said look for some quick wins, try and establish yourself, build your credibility. One of the ways that I've seen people in your role do that is by helping their organisation see round corners, if you want to use that phrase, in terms of providing that competitive intelligence using some external data or maybe what some of your competitors, who they're hiring for, because you can get access to this data. It's widely available, and that can really help, can't it?
David, that's a really good call out right there. I would say, again, if I think about my quick wins at Walmart, I did so much competitive intelligence and benchmarking work. Working with folks at Drop are just amazing. A lot like Cast was just so helpful. That's a huge one. That's one that's just even working with your Gartners of the world and your Aons of the world, to be able to bring that kind of insights in and translate that into what are the implications then in terms of your workforce strategy and the levers you might want to pull. That's a great call. Again, I think it just got so much credibility, and it's an easy lift, right? If you have some of those partnerships and access to that data, that's a good one.
Great. You mentioned Gen AI, and obviously it seems a long time ago. It's only 2 years, wasn't it? I think when it was.
Yeah, it's so insane. And 2 years is 200 years in AI world in my mind, though.
And you mentioned a big part of your book. The update is you're really looking at how the Gen AI and its impacts on strategic workforce planning. So how do you see that? How do you see Gen AI, if I can say it properly, intersecting with strategic workforce planning? What are the opportunities, and maybe what are some of the key considerations?
Yeah, there's it is all consuming for me right now because it is such a major part of the the future of strategic workforce planning, and I'd say even to a lesser extent, or maybe the same for people analytics, in my opinion. And here's why I say that. So for strategic workforce planning, I just kind of mentioned it. The reason why I'm getting invited to all these meetings is I think there's a if we really just kind of bring it back, I think that leaders, or more specifically, a lot of boards across a lot of organizations right now are starting to understand that there are some pretty big opportunities with AI, and that comes in the form of two ways: a, your go-to-market strategy, your service products that you develop, how you can generate revenue through AI. That's not necessarily what I'm talking about right now. That's one benefit, though, potential benefit of AI, but the other is efficiency and productivity, right? And that's, I think something that a lot of organizations are struggling how to do that, whether it's this horizontal integration of getting the products and tools in hands of individual employees to be more productive at work, or that vertical integration of, how do we actually build a agentic AI to build an army of AI agents that can replace, full processes and business systems. Um, but what it means, though, from workforce planning is that there's no question that we need to be able to, as an organization or a function, create some scenarios that allow leaders to plan and react to how this technology evolves. And so, if I'm thinking from a strategic workforce planning, I have a big technology organization, I think one of the most ripe, if not the most ripe area right now for augmentation or total replacement in some worlds maybe is through developers and coding. And what does that mean, though, as an organization? I'm a leader, right? And I have, let's say, I'm a big tech organization. I think you've read in the news. These software engineers and developers are not cheap, or they weren't in the past. Things might change soon, but um, and I'm spending a lot of money on these developers. I now have a technology that could potentially, if not definitely, replace those workers. What do I do? Is it a world where I now think about a workforce plan 3 years from now? What should my more specifically what should my workforce look like? What should that technology function look like? Okay, do I make roles redundant? That's pretty risky, right? Do I let go 20% of the workforce? Do I slow down hiring? Um, do I just not backfill certain roles? Do I redeploy talent into other roles? Do I add more work on to the current roles? And each of these different scenarios has a dramatic impact on what the future of the work could look like, of a workforce could look like, and how I optimize the workforce. Do I upskill? How do I upskill? Like, do we even have the capability to leverage this technology? So again, if I'm thinking about a workforce plan and what I need to be successful, not become redundant and become the next Kodak of the world or the next Blockbuster of the world, I need to make sure that I have a pretty strategic plan in place. And I'm finding that those are the conversations that I'm getting looped into. All of a sudden now, leaders are acting like, yeah, workforce planning. Of course, that we would consider them in this when that wasn't always the case. So that's the first big piece: is how the function actually helps support how we right size and optimize the workforce mix in the future through strategic workforce planning. But then the other side, the flip side, is how you can actually leverage the technology itself to do the planning. Okay, and this is where I start to get really a little bit scared. Of course, everybody gets a little bit scared because I sometimes talk myself out of my own job in this space. But there's some things that AI is just really good at, and pattern recognition is amazing. And so the ability for AI, which I think some of the latest tests say that it's like the same as having like 100 PhDs in stem cells, or STEM sciences. You can leverage pretty confidently a good agent to do some scenario modeling, to do a lot of the work that a typical strategic workforce planning practitioner like myself would be able to do. And I kind of mentioned it earlier. One of the biggest challenges that I found in scaling strategic workforce planning is how do we build that capability, get that capability into the hands of our finance, HR, and leaders without building out an army, right? Like it's not practical to say I'm going to build a team of 50 embedded workforce planners anymore that would work and partner with each leader. It's just not practical. What is practical though is a world in which we build a co-pilot that has the ability to do all of that, that's fully embedded with our data, that has all the knowledge of somebody like me times 1,000 with all those PhDs and that knowledge, to put it in the hands of an HR leader to say, hey, give me 3 scenarios for this job profile, and a strategy for how we could attract them. Like it is just absolutely endless in terms of the possibility. And right now, we're at Nutrien, we're actually working with Microsoft on some of these concepts, and we're doing some pilots. And I was again kind of fortunate enough to get pulled into some of these conversations, and I was kind of like, hey, I'm trying to build this new operating model at Nutrien. Scale is an issue. What's the possibility of a world where we can build an SWP co-pilot? Oh, that's one of the easiest use cases possible that we could build for you. So we'll see where that goes. But this is one of the things I wrote about in the book, where I said, I can just imagine a world where we're prompting agents to do a lot of the stuff that normally would have been like a 6-week project, or a two-month, like a time intensive 3 people consulting project, to be able to get in the hands of our leaders. That's where I really see an example of how this technology can revolutionize the way that we work. So check in with me in about 6 months. We'll see where that goes, if that becomes a real thing. But those are the 2 areas that I see AI really impacting the world of SWP. So you can see why I think it's a pretty big part of the future of this function.
Yeah, both in the workforce planning that you're doing and how you do workforce
And how
planning.
you do it.
You'll
Yeah,
still be
it's
using your
twofold
immense knowledge and experience
experience.
to do the right prompts, but you'll be doing less of the work because the technology. Yeah,
And David, that's exactly like, again, when I'm talking to people about like just the technology, like as we think about skills and how we structure our workforce, it's going to remove all the non-value add work, the time consuming, like munging data. That's what takes so much time, right? Do you want to pay somebody X number of dollars to do that, or do you want to pay somebody and give them 8 hours in a day to thoughtfully think through uh, and connect the dots on these big issues? And if you have everybody doing that, just think about the step change that you can make in the way that you operate as an organization. I think that's when we think about how we sell this and try to reduce the fear, that's what we got to be able to do. Like, hey, it's going to give you time to do the stuff that's important. So learn this technology, and don't you won't have to do all the administrative stuff. It's going to free up more time, and that's where I see the value and the benefit.
Ross, let's shift a little bit to maybe where work gets done and how work gets done, and the role of workforce planning in that. So, obviously, well, we're in 2025. So 5 years ago, everyone in a white collar job was pretty much working remotely. And I know there's all sorts of stuff in the press about certain organisations bringing people back into the office 4 or 5 days a week, and others staying remote. But it seems that we're more working in a hybrid way, certainly than we were prior to the pandemic. Um, it's still obviously a significant part of organisational design for companies today, and I can't think of any reason it won't be in the future. How are you seeing leading companies in strategic workforce planning navigate this?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm kind of more aligned with you, David, in terms of how I think about this. I know there's been a big shift, and a lot of these sort of CEOs and senior leaders are wanting to get everybody back in the office. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think for the ones that do get it right, I think there's a balance, and it is kind of this more hybrid world. I think some of the things that the top companies are doing, and some of the things I write about in the book, that they can be doing to ensure that they're thinking about their location strategy and their working models more strategically, is first you want to, and I talk a lot about this in the book too, this concept of workforce segmentation. This is a really good example of an opportunity to segment the workforce by role, in terms of thinking about when we're hiring and creating job architecture and job design, job descriptions, what type of jobs should actually be or could actually be remote versus the jobs that should be in the office. And so, it's a matter of kind of getting segmenting and better understanding that. That's when we can start to use the data and people analytics. So thinking about those different segments and what makes actually sense. I think the biggest piece that organizations are missing with this that they got right initially is it's a huge, huge opportunity for a talent attraction lever, right? Like there's the reality is I think it's pretty clear that the employees want the flexibility of working from home. I think there's mixed results in terms of if it impacted productivity or not. Maybe, I think I'd like to see more data on that. But the reality is, from a talent attraction perspective and a retention lever, uh, it should be part of your suite of tools that you use. So I think good organizations understand this, and in a world where we're still battling to get the best and most engaged employees, it has to be a consideration. I just don't love the idea from a talent strategy perspective of just completely shutting that lever down. So that's something that good employers are definitely doing. I think to that end, the ones that have embraced hybrid work or these strategies also understand that the reason why leaders sometimes don't like them is because they don't feel like there's enough collaboration or productivity happening. So the organizations that are getting this right are the ones that are spending a lot of time on designing the right working model to ensure that there's that uh, connectivity between the collaboration and productivity, and you're not losing that in the remote world. So it's the way you're designing the orgs, it's the way that you're building out your meeting rhythms and the technology that you're using, the way that you're training leaders, right? How do we train our leaders? How do we train our employees to be effective in a remote world? And I think that's the part that was missing, when the pandemic hit, and it was, I mean, rightfully so, right? Everything happened so fast. Now we have this opportunity, and the organizations that are doing this right have this opportunity to thoughtfully design these working models, ensure that we have the right training and the right technology infrastructure to be able to do it more seamless, so it doesn't feel like we're losing that collaboration and that connective tissue. And I think that there's also a lot of organizations that are focusing a lot on the policy and the cultural integration, and that kind of goes back to this collaboration piece. But let's ensure that we have equality with how we make the decisions, whether it's how we're doing meetings, how we're doing talent management, incentivizing employees, and how we're ensuring that there is a level playing field for all the workers, whether they're remote or not. And so being very thoughtful about that and ensuring that there's no bias, which again, it just feels like there is. I don't have specific data on that, but those are some of the things that I've seen that good organizations are doing. And then, of course, to put the strategic workforce planning hat on, there should also be some scenario planning too, right? Like, let's actually get tactical around what's the ratio of remote workers to hybrid to FTEs. Let's understand the cost benefit. There's honestly, there's opportunities for reducing a lot of office space. So let's make sure that we bring in the cost. Let's do the scenarios. Let's understand, and be prepared for the next pandemic, right? And what that would mean to mobilize a remote workforce again. So those are some of the things. Obviously, data, not taking a one size fits all approach. Some of the more common themes that we think about, ensuring that we hear the voice of the employee as well, which again, it sounds like it's been a miss in certain situations where we're just completely ignoring what the talent are saying, and looking at talent market trends. Where are the talent? All these things I think need to be rolled up into really what I would kind of call this remote or hybrid workforce strategy.
Yeah, really good. Lots we could dig into there, but I'm conscious that
Yeah.
we've got a few more questions to get through. We hear a lot about future proofing the workforce. What does that really mean today in the here and now?
That's a great question, and I've reflected on this a lot myself. Um, when I think about future-proofing the workforce, I think it really means building a workforce today that can adapt and thrive and stay relevant amid the changes of today, tomorrow, and all the technologies that are happening. Right? That's what So what does that mean in practice? I think it touches on a lot of the things that we've kind of been discussing, ensuring that we're not losing touch of the importance of skills, and the importance of what those skills that will be required in the future where we're working next to agents, right? Learning, what does it mean to learn, and how do we make learning more continuous, because things are changing so rapidly, right? And I just don't know that we're evolving the way that we approach agility and learning as fast as the technology and the world is changing. So that's something that's really important. I think just this whole concept of adaptability and agility in the workforce is important. We need leaders, we need employees that are not scared, which I think that there's a good chunk of the workforce is, that are not disengaged, that feel empowered and that are excited about the agency they have in their own career, right? And that's built through a culture of adapting to change, a culture of embracing agility, a culture of rewarding employees that are adaptable and have growth mindsets that want to learn. I think we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier in the skills piece, but internal mobility is going to be really important in the future. And so, gone are the days, I think we can all agree, where you sit in one role for 30 years, you have a big retirement party. That's just not the world that we're living in anymore. And so, this concept of internal mobility and career fluidity in a world where these some roles are changing and maybe being made redundant, but a lot more new and exciting ones are happening. How do we ensure that when we're doing our workforce planning, that we're incentivizing, leaders to not hoard talent, but to work cross-functionally and collaboratively in terms of giving out, employees the opportunity to try different careers and learn different things, are all really important. Obviously, I keep talking about scenario planning and the importance of ensuring that we think about all the different scenarios in the future, and that leaders are equipped with all these different scenarios, such that if track A happens in the future, whatever that might be, we feel like we've spent the time, from a workforce perspective, from a workforce planning perspective, to know at least initially what we have to do to get a plan in place to address it. So that just that agility and that scenario planning and that sense of readiness are all, things that I would consider, important to sort of future-proof the workforce of the future.
Analytics, data. You've talked about the importance of that,
And data, of course. I mean, that's table stakes.
and you talked about the importance of people data. And we've talked through competitor data, location data. We've talked about internal data, external data to the organisation, all to help you with your workforce strategic workforce planning. Many of our listeners sit at the intersection of people analytics and workforce planning, and interestingly, some of the research that we've done at Insight 222, as we've seen the people analytics operating model evolve, we've seen certain things become more commonly part of a bigger function. It might be people analytics and strategy and planning. And roughly 50% of the companies we studied last year in 2024, which was 348 companies, I think, off the top of my head, 50% of them have workforce planning and people analytics together. I'd love to hear your view on that, because you worked in different organizations, and there's clearly no one size fits all, because you need to apply it to the organization. How should the functions work together? Should they be together? And what capabilities and then maybe what are the capabilities that are critical to building and leading a modern SWP function? So about three questions in one there. Sorry, Ross.
Yeah, no, they're all really good questions. And I have been fortunate enough to have worked in all different sort of models. Again, going right back to one of the first things we discussed, I just can't imagine, from a workforce planning perspective, I can't imagine a world where data and analytics are just not part of modern workforce planning. So in my mind, it does work best when they're in the same function. Now, in terms of how we structure the function, there maybe it's a three in the box. Like, there's all different types of modes and ways of doing that. But I really like, in my mind, and I think it's most effective when the two sit together. And a couple of things that I think just are important in terms of that relationship. It's really, and some of the things that I've seen that haven't happened is, when in the past, in some situations, there has been a bit of a siloed approach, and I think that's because there's not always a shared understanding of the goals and the questions that the business are trying to answer. And you could think of a world where, people analytics and the data are what help you diagnose some of the workforce problems, and the planning component takes those diagnostics and turns them into an action plan, right? So they're really a yin and yang. They're so inseparable in my mind. So to be able to really ensure that when we're thinking about people analytics and planning, it's part of, in my mind, like an ecosystem or an end-to-end part of the business. I know that there's going to be moments, shout out to my PSYOP and my PhDs and org effectiveness and you know uh, IO psychology, but where you might there's just like some sort of a research question we want to answer. But I just can't imagine a world where there's not some sort of a tie back to then, like, how do we turn this into an actionable part of our plan? So those are, it's really important, I think, to sort of consider that. The data piece is another huge bridge, right? And sometimes it's been something where I haven't seen as much alignment as there should be. We need to ensure that we're all using the same types of definitions from the planning perspective to the people analytics perspective. We need to ensure that we all agree on the structure of the data and like how we're using the data. That's been something that I've seen get tripped up a lot. Is if there's two people analytics on the planning team in an org, and they're not agreeing on what even attrition, the definition of attrition means, the difference between like developing an aggregate attrition forecast versus like an individual probabilistic model, and the different sort of ways in which you would use forecasting and the different sort of more sophisticated types of modeling that you could do to diagnose some of the root causes in attrition. Like, in my experience, not always, there always hasn't been as much alignment there as there could be, and so to the extent that you're able to sort of get that, I think it really accelerates and leads to much more synergistic benefits to having the two teams working together. I think there's an opportunity for more cross training and skills blending. I think in my experience, I haven't seen it sometimes. I think there's more of a gap in the workforce planning space around having more analytical skills sometimes. Um, and I think that's an opportunity for a lot of workforce planning practitioners to learn from their people analytics, partners. I think sometimes what I've seen in the people analytics space is maybe not as much of an understanding, not always, but of the strategic implications of the workforce and what that means in terms of business performance and impact. So there could be opportunities to not just think about this in terms of like a research question that we're trying to answer, like a PhD thesis question, but more of like okay, let's get. It's great that we built this attrition model, but we don't have an attrition problem here, right? Like these types of like let's tie the business and the need and the strategy more to the analytics that we're doing. So sum it all up again. Like I'm of the mindset that they should work together very closely. I can't imagine one being successful without the other, especially the workforce planning piece using the data and the analytics.
No, very good, Ross. Well, we've already got to the last question, which is the question of the series, and which is almost could have been written for you, because we've talked about the shift towards skills as well. How can HR lead the shift to skills powered workforce planning?
Well, I mean, this is a big one. I think the first thing when I think about skills based workforce planning, and I think about HR's role in that, is that there is a huge amount of change that has to happen for I think leaders and the business to fully adapt to skills-based workforce planning. So HR really needs to lead the narrative and create the business case for why it's going to be so important and what that means for leaders and what they need to think about in terms of skills-based workforce planning. I think another really key important area that needs to happen is there really needs to be a strong understanding and a framework in place for developing not job taxonomies but skills taxonomies, right? And I think sometimes, and this is again where we can start to leverage data and some of the benchmarking work that you discussed, but there really needs to be an actual skills taxonomy. I think that there needs to be an ongoing discussion. We talked about this a little bit earlier, um, around making the skills part of the discussion much more relevant to the work that HR and that leaders think about, right? So rather than just thinking about performance management like we historically have, really placing more of an emphasis around, are we incentivizing, employees that have went above and beyond to learn new different skills? Are we really thinking about career mobility in terms of skills, right? How do we think about internal mobility through the context of really building what I would almost call like an on-demand, constantly updated skills inventory, right? We need to get to, and we need the systems and the infrastructure to be able to do that. So you can imagine a world then where it's not a question of how many roles we have. It's a question of what skills do we have, and to be able to do that requires HR going out, taking the time to understand the skills that we have today, taking time to understand the skills going to be needed tomorrow, working with leaders to understand where there are gaps, working across the entire HR function to say, okay, well, here's where we need to focus our learning and development. It shouldn't necessarily be on, you know, typical coursework that we've done, which we still need to include, but we really need to focus on where those gaps exist. And that's, I think, when we can start to get to a world there, and then again, starting to celebrate the quick wins. I think that's where we're going to really start to see much more of this embedded kind of workforce planning and skills-based workforce planning in the organization, including skills as part of the workforce planning is just so important, and it's going to become such a high priority as we continue to kind of shift into the future, and we're in a world where AI and some of the things we've discussed in terms of the future of work become much more of a reality.
Yeah, really good, Ross. And as you said, as we talked about connecting that all to the business priorities and where the
Business
business
priorities.
business strategy is. It's a great way of connecting strategy, planning, and analytics together, isn't it? And giving
Exactly.
value to employees as well, so they're actually investing their time in developing the skills that are going to benefit them as well as the organization.
And just one final note on that, David, too. I think the challenge that I've seen, this is another really kind of good use case and something I'm excited about for AI. I think the challenge that I've seen in the past is it's really a really time intensive, like difficult activity to go and do a skills assessment, right? And I think that this is a world where I think that we can really dramatically accelerate the learning curve and scale our ability to do that with AI. It's I've played around with it a little bit, and I think there's some vendors that are coming out with some really unique and interesting value propositions and products. I think this is a really good one that if you're a leader and you're trying to understand, like, how do we do this at scale, really think about how this is being an opportunity to leverage AI. Do some research on it. I've seen some really interesting things, and my mind is kind of buzzing around how we could use this technology. We did some of this at when we were kind of doing an AI impact assessment, which is kind of tangentially related, and at Walmart, and we were able to really quickly scale and develop kind of a profile of how AI could impact these roles and the skills required, but didn't take it at base value. Spent a lot of time validating it, and I think what the validation showed me was that it was pretty close. So that just, to me, again, leads me to believe it's a great opportunity to leverage this technology.
Yeah, I love that skills inference. So we've got all that data that we can internal data that we confer skills of employees on. And funny enough, the sponsor of this series of the podcast is a company, TechWolf, one of those companies that helps you to do that. And I know it's something certainly during my time at IBM did back in the 2010s and around skills inference. And as you said, they found out it was pretty much as accurate as asking employees their skills and then asking managers to validate those skills, and a lot more time type effective.
Exactly, or maybe even more accurate. Like let's be
Yeah.
honest, if you factor in the bias um, right, yeah,
And it's out of date once
exactly.
you've completed it as well.
You completed it, and that's why you gotta get to this world where you're doing something that's continuous, right? And you have this inventory that's constantly updated and reflects the reality of the workforce, etc.
Ross, it's been wonderful talking to you again. And again, thanks for sharing insights from your immense experience in this space, plus your kind of thoughts about how it might evolve, and obviously insights from the second edition of Strategic Workforce Planning. Before we go, can you share with listeners how they can find out more about the book, and maybe follow you and all the great work you're doing?
Yeah, a couple things. So first, you can pretty much go anywhere that books are sold, Amazon, any sort of website that sells books to get the book, Strategic Workforce Planning, Developing Talent, Optimized Talent Strategies for Future Growth. It touches on everything that David and I have been talking about and more. So definitely recommend getting out and if you want to get deeper into some of these topics, get reading that. I'm very active on LinkedIn, so reach out to me there. And I think most recently and really kind of exciting, I've also recently launched my own think tank around all these topics that's really focused on it's called Talent Stratify, so you can find it at talentstratify.com. And it was really focused on creating content, creating frameworks, creating thought pieces, and providing advisory services on everything that we've sort of discussed here with kind of an eye towards Gen AI integration in this kind of world of workforce planning. But it really touches on everything that we have here, and it's something that I'm going to build and grow, and really just use as a resource, hopefully for people to come to get more tools and understanding, and on this space, and for me to be able to share all my vast experience.
Great. Well, we'll put links to all those things in the show notes, everyone. But the book, talentstratify.com, and then obviously look for Ross Sparkman on LinkedIn as well. Ross, thank you very much for being on the show. Hopefully we'll bump into each other at a conference in the not too distant future. But until then, thank you very much.
Love it, David. And thanks again for having me. Looking forward to catching up soon.
In this series, we will be speaking to a range of senior leaders who are pushing a data-driven and digital HR agenda. Make sure that you subscribe via your podcast app of choice and also via our YouTube channel for free and regular interviews with the digital HR leaders of the future.